Players had to press their faces into a tabletop visor, stare into a harsh red and black display, and hope the headache did not arrive before the game ended. This was the Virtual Boy, released by Nintendo in 1995, when the company still seemed almost impossible to bet against. So how did the maker of Mario and the Game Boy launch a machine this uncomfortable, this unfinished, and this quickly abandoned? By 1995, the video game industry was caught between generations. The Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis were still popular, but they were beginning to look old. Their biggest games were stretching two-dimensional hardware with bigger sprites, smoother animation, and fake depth effects, while the next wave of machines promised something far more exciting: real three-dimensional worlds. Sony's PlayStation had launched in Japan at the end of 1994, and it made polygons feel like the new standard almost overnight. Sega was pushing the Saturn. Arcades were already showing players games like Virtua Fighter, Daytona USA, and Ridge Racer, where cameras moved through space and characters looked like solid objects. The message was clear: the flat-screen era was ending. At the same time, virtual reality was becoming a cultural obsession. Tech magazines ran glossy features about headsets, data gloves, and digital worlds you could step inside. Shopping malls and arcades experimented with expensive virtual reality pods. Movies and television treated cyberspace like the next frontier. The promise was huge, even if the actual hardware was usually heavy, low resolution, and wildly expensive. Nintendo had a unique advantage in that moment. This was the company that turned a gray box into the Nintendo Entertainment System, made the Game Boy a phenomenon with a green screen, and kept selling strange ideas by attaching them to great games. If Nintendo said it had found a way into three-dimensional play, people had reason to pay attention. So when Nintendo prepared its own vision of the future, the expectations were enormous. What it revealed was not a doorway into another world. It was the first sign that the dream of true three-dimensional gaming could go very wrong. The Virtual Boy arrived in Japan in July 1995, then in North America later that year, with a launch price of about $179.99. Nintendo described it as a new kind of three-dimensional game system, but the object itself was difficult to categorize the moment people saw it. It was not a home console in the normal sense, because it did not connect to a television. It was not a handheld in the Game Boy sense, because you could not comfortably hold it in your hands and play anywhere. The Virtual Boy sat on a small stand, and the player leaned into a visor to look through two eyepieces. To use it, you placed it on a table, adjusted the stand, lined up your face, and stayed there. That setup created an immediate practical problem. The name suggested something personal and portable, almost like a futuristic Game Boy, but the experience was fixed, awkward, and physically demanding. Players had to hunch forward, keep their head in position, and use a separate controller while looking into the machine. It felt less like stepping into virtual reality and more like operating a strange kiosk built for one person. Inside the visor, the system produced a stereoscopic image, giving each eye a slightly different view to create the illusion of depth. That was the main technical idea. The trade-off was the screen. Instead of full color, Virtual Boy games appeared in sharp red images against a black background. Nintendo chose that look partly because full-color displays with the right brightness, speed, and cost were not practical for a consumer product at that price. Red light-emitting diodes were cheaper and easier to use, but they gave every game the same harsh visual identity. Before anyone could decide whether the games were worth playing, the hardware raised a more basic question. Was this supposed to replace a handheld, compete with a console, or deliver virtual reality on a budget? The Virtual Boy never made that answer clear. The most damaging problems appeared after the player actually started a game. The Virtual Boy's display was built around red light-emitting diodes, so every world was reduced to bright red lines floating in black space. That made the three-dimensional effect possible at a lower cost, but it also made the visuals aggressive. There were no soft colors, no natural lighting, and no visual variety to help the eyes relax. A tennis court, a space corridor, and a puzzle screen all carried the same intense red glow. That mattered because players were not glancing at a screen across the room. They were pressing their face into a visor and staring directly into the display. After even a short session, the image could feel tiring. Longer sessions were linked by many players to headaches, eye strain, and sometimes nausea. Nintendo even built in automatic pause reminders, a feature that quietly admitted the system was not comfortable to use for too long. The physical setup made the problem worse. The Virtual Boy rested on a stand, and the player had to lean forward at the right angle to see properly. If the table height was wrong, the position became awkward quickly. Instead of relaxing on a couch or holding a portable system naturally, players often ended up with their neck bent toward the machine. The bigger contradiction was that Nintendo was selling a kind of virtual reality without the features people expected from that idea. There was no head tracking. Turning your head did not change the view. The world did not surround you, and because only one person could see the screen, the experience was difficult to share with friends in the room. The Virtual Boy did not just just look strange on a shelf. Its real failure was that playing it felt like work. The Virtual Boy also arrived at the worst possible moment inside Nintendo itself. By 1995, Nintendo was already preparing for the machine that actually represented its next generation, the Nintendo 64. That console promised polygonal three-dimensional worlds on a television, a traditional controller, and the kind of big-budget games that could define the company's future. Compared with that, the Virtual Boy felt like a side project that had been pushed into stores before it had a real place in the lineup. That timing mattered, because new hardware needs full commitment. It needs marketing, software support, developer confidence, and enough time to explain why it should exist. The Virtual Boy did not get that runway. As attention shifted toward the Nintendo 64, the red and black visor was left trying to justify itself with a small library and a confusing identity. The games were not enough to save it. Mario's Tennis showed off the depth effect, but it was not the kind of must-have title that sells a strange machine on its own. Other releases experimented with racing, puzzle games, shooters, and platformers, yet the library stayed limited. There was no Super Mario World moment, no Tetris moment, and no experience powerful enough to make the awkward hardware feel necessary. For developers, the situation was risky. The install base was tiny, the display was restrictive, and Nintendo's own future was clearly moving elsewhere. That made third-party support harder to attract, which made the library even thinner, which made the system even harder to recommend. The result was a product caught between business pressure and bad timing. Nintendo needed something new on shelves before the Nintendo 64 was ready, but the Virtual Boy did not have the polish, comfort, or software to carry that role. And once reviewers and customers finally got their hands and eyes on it, the reaction was brutal. The backlash arrived almost immediately. Reviewers did not treat the Virtual Boy like a bold new frontier. They treated it like a strange experiment that had escaped the lab too early. The red visuals were mocked for being harsh and limited. The tabletop design was criticized for forcing players into an awkward posture. Even the three-dimensional effect, the entire reason the machine existed, was often described as a gimmick rather than a revolution. Word of mouth was even worse. Players reported headaches, eye strain, and nausea after using it, which was devastating for a device built around putting your face into the hardware. Nintendo added warnings and recommended breaks, but that only reinforced the idea that this was not a normal game system. It felt like something you had to endure. Then there was the price. At launch, the Virtual Boy was expensive enough to feel like a serious purchase, but too risky to feel safe. Parents and players could spend that money on proven consoles, better game libraries, or simply wait for the Nintendo 64. The Virtual Boy had to convince people fast, and it never did. Sales collapsed below Nintendo expectations. Worldwide, the system sold roughly 770,000 to 777,000 units, a tiny number for a company used to dominating living rooms and handheld gaming. Retailers lost confidence, software slowed down, and the system disappeared almost as quietly as it had arrived. Nintendo discontinued it in Japan by late 1995. In the United States, it was gone from the market by 1996. That made the Virtual Boy one of the shortest-lived systems Nintendo ever released. It became a punchline, a warning, and a collector's curiosity. But buried inside that failure was an idea the industry was not finished with. The Virtual Boy became Nintendo's clearest warning that vision is not enough. Modern virtual reality would later solve what it could not: sharper displays, motion tracking, lighter headsets, and software built for immersion. Nintendo did not fail because it imagined three-dimensional gaming. It failed because it sold the future before the future was ready. Thanks for watching, and tell me in the comments, was the Virtual Boy a disaster or just too early?